Hello everyone, and welcome to this video where I'm going to discuss basically my past and how I ended up in the situation in which I'm currently in. So I had my first dislocation when I was 13 and a half. I was helping a very good friend of mine, Josh, with a paper round. I was walking up Springfield Road in Wantage, and I caught my left foot on what can only be described as a modern manhole cover. And for those of you who don't know what those are, it's not the old-fashioned sort of ironwork ones. They're the ones that look like concrete with a metal perimeter around the outside, and I believe they're for things like phone cables, or these days fibre optic and broadband cables. Now, there was one sticking out into a driveway. I was talking to Josh, not really paying attention to where I was going, caught my left foot on the edge of it and stepped forward with the right leg, brought the left leg forward, and it flicked drastically. And at that point, I felt the kneecap go round to the side. I shouted to Josh, "I think I've dislocated my knee," and I hit the ground. This was late November, at night, early evening, but in Britain, that makes it pretty darn dark, and we're illuminated by the orange street lights, and I'm lying on the ground in absolute agony. And bearing in mind, up to that point, having played rugby and cricket and done judo and generally been a bit of a rough and tumble child, I'd broken fingers, I'd broken my nose, that was kind of the limit of my experience. I'd had a lot of sort of cuts and scrapes and bumps and bruises, but nothing more than that. And I remember some of the residents who lived outside where I'd hit the pavement came outside with blankets and a duvet and pillows and sort of made me as comfortable as possible, while my friend Josh called his mum and then proceeded to call the ambulance. And the ambulance was there very quickly, sort of 5-10 minutes, but when you're going through a dislocation and that kind of pain, it seems like a lot longer. Anyway, they proceeded to give me Entonox, which is not the nitrous oxide, and at that point I'd never had it before, so the world was spinning, and it wasn't the most pleasant experience, but it sure did help with the pain. And back then in the UK, paramedics, particularly experienced paramedics, were able to put dislocations back themselves. In fact, they were encouraged to. So my mum came along. She'd been called by Josh's mum, and the paramedics helped to put my knee back. Obviously, at that point, I'd never done it before, so I didn't have a clue really what was going on. I was just trying to avoid throwing up from the pain and the dizziness caused by the Entonox. And they popped me into my mum's car and took me along to the hospital. And there, I was only there for 45 minutes. Now, it's kind of a bit of a joke in the British NHS that you don't really want to go to hospital in August, September, October, or in some cases even into November, because that's when you've got the brand new doctors in A&E and things like that. And I remember seeing this very young doctor, very young lady, and she saw me for all of about 30 seconds, said, "Well, the paramedics have put your kneecap back. You're free to go home," basically. She was very busy. There was a lot of people in there. It had been quite cold, so there was a lot of older people in there who'd fallen on ice and things like that. And I went back to school the next day. That was it, as far as we were concerned. And then a couple of days later, somebody thought it would be a really good idea to sort of kick me in the back of the left leg, and my kneecap came out, and that caused a huge amount of pain. I was kind of left on my own dealing with it for a considerable period of time, and then eventually my dad sort of came to the school, picked me up and took me across to the hospital, where they were like, "Yeah, we'll sort your knee out." And that kind of set a bit of a pattern then, in terms of every month or so I would dislocate my left kneecap. It caused a huge amount of pain. I did see one orthopaedic surgeon while I was attending the hospital in Oxford, so that's the John Radcliffe Hospital, and I don't really remember what he said back then, but I think it was along the lines of, basically, we'll just watch and see what happens. And then when I was just after my 14th birthday, moved up to Fife in Scotland, and the knee problems came with me. Every month or so I was having a dislocation. I remember one particular incident. I was on my way back to school towards the end of lunch, and I dislocated crossing a road in the small town of Anstruther. And the way the road is, there's a small rise on the road, which means that if you're coming basically from the northeasterly stroke easterly direction to west, you won't necessarily see what's just below that rise. And it's 30-mile-an-hour road, so it's not the fastest, but I hit the deck there and I could hear a vehicle coming, and I'll be honest, I kind of panicked because my kneecap's out and I'm lying on the road and it's not a good combination. So anyway, so I smacked my kneecap as hard as I could, trying to get it back in. I did feel it go back, and I scampered off the road and tried to make it as far as I could to school. I did run into some people I knew. They were an older brother and a friend of his, of one of my friends, and they sort of took me one under each arm and took me down to school. And I remember I was having major issues because although the kneecap was back, it wasn't back properly. There were issues finding the pulse in my foot. There were police officers at the school for part of their community efforts and things like that, and they were known to me because of my mum's partner at the time. He was a police officer, so I knew them socially, and they were struggling to find a pulse on my foot. And obviously I was taken to hospital by ambulance, and that was a rather unpleasant experience. Now, after a couple of dislocations, I was attending the fracture clinic, as they called it. So for anyone who dislocated or broke a bone or anything and presented to accident and emergency, a couple of days later they would go to the fracture clinic, and this was at Ninewells Hospital in Dundee. And there I met my first the first gentleman who'd gone to be a surgeon of mine. And he made it abundantly clear that he didn't want to operate on me immediately because they still thought I had some growing to do, and doing serious knee operations on growing kids is not really an ideal circumstance. So it was very much in his mind to, well, let's wait as long as we can. And at that point I was having a dislocation every month, every 3 weeks or so. And we got to just after my birthday, my 15th birthday, and at that point he made the decision. He said, look, we can't really wait anymore. Rob's just over 6 foot tall now. It's really kind of now or never. So I signed the forms. I remember the colour, the pink forms, and I ended up going for my first operation at the Perth Royal Infirmary, and that was November 20th, 2006. And there were issues with that operation. Some I found out at the time, some I found out years later, and there'd been issues because the operation had gone on longer than they wanted it to. There was more damage to the knee than they thought there would be. So the plan was that they were going to do a tibial tubercle transfer, so that's a little bit of bone on your shin bone that anchors basically the bottom of your kneecap and the tissue that connects to that. And they moved that on my shin bone, and they pinned it in place with 2 titanium pins, and they also did what they call a lateral release, where they cut some of the tissue inside the knee, and that's then supposed to stop pulling it over more towards the lateral side, so the outside of the knee. And that was my first night in hospital, and I had all sorts of issues because they give me a huge amount of anaesthetic, huge amount of muscle relaxant. So there's me struggling after the operation, braced up from ankle to basically my pelvis effectively on the left side, and not being able to go to toilet at all because I had so much muscle relaxant. So there's me as a 15-year-old boy being catheterized, which is never a fun experience, as anyone will tell you. And the next day I was plastered up in the plaster room, sent home, and the recovery went pretty quickly. He said it could take anywhere between 6 to 9 months, but the prevailing thought afterwards now is that I was sort of about due a growth spurt, and we think that energy and that the physical materials involved went into re-knitting the knee very quickly. So I had physiotherapy, went through all that process, and bear in mind my ambition was to join the army as an officer. And I remember going to my final kind of follow-up appointment for the left knee, being checked over by the surgeon and being told, yeah, your knee's healed well, it's tracking pretty well, you can go back to playing rugby, you can go back to doing all these things, don't see any reason why you shouldn't be able to kind of pursue a career in the armed forces, absolutely fine, no issue. So we're getting pretty close to my 16th birthday then. During this process, I've been applying to Welbeck. For those who don't know, Welbeck's a military school, effectively in Britain. It's a voluntary military school where people go for sixth form, so they go to do their A-levels, and then would go on to a set group of universities that the military had agreements with. Sadly, because I'd had the knee operation, the army was very much along the lines of, no, we're not gonna get involved in your situation. But the Navy, on the other hand, was saying, yeah, we'll take you. So just after my 16th birthday, I went down to Portsmouth. I did the Admiralty interview board, scored very highly, was offered a place at Welbeck, and then in the September. So this was September 2007. I went down, and within a week and a half played my first game of rugby, got tackled badly, damaged my left knee. Actually, on the x-rays at the hospital in Leicester, you could see where the pins had actually been driven into the fibula, so that's the bone at the back of the shin, and you could see the cracks and things. And sadly, because of all the pressure I was placing on the right knee, a week after that injury, I got up in the night to go to the bathroom, and as I was getting out of bed, I dislocated my right kneecap. Welbeck said, well, basically we got two choices. You can either leave, get this sorted out, and that still gives you the chance to try and get in later, but if we bring a doctor up from London and they evaluate you, they'll basically say you're not fit to serve. And obviously I was desperate to go ahead with my plans, so I left Welbeck, which hurt a lot. Obviously my first plan in terms of joining the army was already gone. Losing Welbeck was a major blow as well, and spent some time with my father down in Northamptonshire, and there proceeded to have further surgery at the Kettering General Hospital. So the first operation was done on my right knee, and there were all kinds of issues post that one as well. We'll cover that one in a separate video, but suffice to say, putting somebody in a plaster of Paris cast just after surgery and then putting them in a bed with a morphine pump with the volumes off and a broken buzzer to call for help is not really a great combination. I went back to Scotland, was having issues with the left knee because of the pins. The pins were taken out. Back to Northamptonshire, and then had an operation on the left knee. And at this point in time, I was looking at university, and a subject I enjoyed very much at school was chemistry, so I thought, well, the armed forces is not really an option anymore, so let's go for something I enjoy. And I applied to and was successful in getting a place at the University of Hull, which has one of the world's foremost chemistry departments, and I was there to do a combined degree and master's in chemistry and nanotechnology. I was there a grand total of 4 weeks, and they had, at that point in time, in the first year, every Wednesday you did a full day in the labs, and my knees couldn't take it, sadly, and for health and safety you can't really sit down in a lab where you've got hot liquids and acids, bases and reactive agents all around. So it was that put me onto the crutches full time. So bear in mind, obviously I'd first sort of been on crutches at 13 and had spent almost half my kind of teenage years up to my 18th birthday, and just after my 18th birthday I'd spent almost half my time on crutches. I'd played my last game of rugby at 16, played my last game of cricket at about 15, been involved with judo 15 for the last time, so I'd lost quite a lot at this point. And I came back up to Fife, to my mum's place, and at that point in time met with the surgeon from the very first operation, and he said because of the surgeries and the ongoing issues with dislocations on both knees, that crutches were now my reality every single day. You know, I was going to be spending all my time on crutches, which hurt. Again, going from somebody who was very physically active and physically able, and at 14 and 15 was actually helping out tradespeople and things like that during my school holidays, just carrying heavy things around for them and being physically active and things and earning money doing that, to then be told that I was going to be on crutches full time was a big blow. And I didn't really have a plan of what to do next. Obviously, I'd had multiple plans thrown out the window by my health, and I remember having a conversation with my father, and he said to me that I was really going to need a degree because physical jobs were out the window for me, and he suggested I should consider something like law because it's a well-respected degree, and it did lead into a number of career fields, but because it was a well-respected degree, even if I didn't want to go down the law route, I'd still have options. So I applied to the University of Dundee, and at that point in time, and I believe it still is, a top 10 law school in the UK, and I applied to do English law, and I was accepted because I already had my standard grades and my hires from Scotland. So I started when I was 19. I started in 2010 in the September-October, and the first year I was on the crutches, having some dislocations, but it was manageable. And at the beginning of my second year, so going into 2011, it was at this point where I started having more dislocations, and I had my first ever bilateral dislocation. So that's where one kneecap would dislocate, and in the process you will naturally shift your weight to avoid yourself falling over, and doing that would actually cause issues with the other knee and cause that to dislocate, and that happens in the space of 1 to maybe 3 seconds at most. So it really is blink and you've fallen over. And I was spending basically weeks at a time inside hospital, because every time I left I was then going out, trying to go back to uni, dislocating, hitting the pavement, being brought back. The pain was excruciating. It was just a bad situation. And I met another surgeon, so this is back at Ninewells Hospital in Dundee. And I should add, part of the reason I'd chosen Dundee for the law degree was not only because of my respect for their position and the fact that a top 10 law school affords you certain opportunities that lower ranked law schools don't, but it was also the fact that I had a hospital and surgeons in the area that I knew when it was inevitable from the conversations I'd had that future surgeries would be required. So I had a chat with a new surgeon, and he explained to me he'd been doing a fellowship over in Australia, and over there he'd picked up a new technique. So they did a small operation on me first, again at the Perth Royal Infirmary, to put scopes into my left knee and have a good look at that. And that would have been my 5th operation at that point in time. And then towards the end of my second year at university, so we're getting towards the summer of 2012, I have the first MPFL rebuild, and then a few months later, at the end of the summer, I have my second MPFL rebuild. And at this point in time, there's kind of curiosity from the surgeon's point of view as to why I'm still having issues with dislocations, but there's no real in-depth investigation as to why it's going on. It's just, from their point of view, assumed to be bad luck, even though I found out later there were questions from another surgeon as to whether I did suffer a condition like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So I finished off university. Now, from a pain point of view, I'd experienced chronic pain from the end of my first operation back when I was 15, and back then the pain was so manageable that I wasn't even taking over-the-counter medication like paracetamol, ibuprofen or aspirin to control it. But as time went on, more dislocations, more surgeries, the pain got worse and worse and worse, and I was taking huge doses of oxycodone as well as other medications like gabapentin and pregabalin and things like that to try and manage the chronic pain in terms of the nerve damage, and also manage pain from dislocations. I was also seeing the pain clinic at Ninewells Hospital, so there they were working on me with things like lidocaine infusions, which are big IV bags of lidocaine that they would infuse into me, and I would always come out battleship grey. It really did take a lot out of me, and those were designed to last for weeks at a time. As I found out later with the EDS, they didn't do a huge amount at the time, but obviously I was of the attitude of, well, anything's better than nothing, let's keep doing it. And towards the end of my second year, as I was sort of coming up from this surgery and going into my third year, as I was recovering from the second of the two MPFL rebuilds, I started to drink as well, because the pain was causing me a lot of issues. I was struggling to control it, and I wasn't sleeping well as a result. And that's not a good combination, as I'm sure you can imagine. You get pushed into a desperate situation, but no excuses. Looking back, I can understand why, as a very young guy, I was sort of into that situation, but, no excuses for it. In the end, I went to hospital, and I dried out from the alcohol and the painkillers, and I was determined to try and manage the chronic pain and manage the pain I was living through at that point without medication at all, which I did for a number of years. I went several years in my 20s without using the pain relief. So I graduated in the summer of 2014 with a upper second class, so a 2-1. I was also awarded the Dean's Medal, which is not something that's awarded every year, but basically for people who overcome significant adversities and go on to achieve well during their degree. And because I'd spent so much of my time in hospital, missing exams and then having to cover them during the summer, I hadn't done the work placements that I really needed to get a good opportunity post-university. So I did some work here and there, and eventually was able to find a job with my local council, Fife Council, where I helped people in schools into work placements and then into apprenticeships and things like that, and that was incredibly rewarding. It was a contract, it wasn't a permanent job, because it was dependent on central funding, and I wasn't able to drive, which obviously made it a bit more difficult trying to travel around the local area on the buses and things, but I was determined to do the best I could. And I was saving up during that course because I was thinking about going down to England and doing my law practice course to look at qualifying as a solicitor and try and get a job as a solicitor. So I did that. I started the law practice course in Leeds. My health deteriorated even further. I met a very helpful surgeon at Pinderfields Hospital in Wakefield at this point in time. And we're talking sort of 2016 going into 2017 at this point in time. And the pain's bad, but I'm doing my best to manage it without pain relief, though pain relief is starting to creep back in, though it's over-the-counter stuff at this point in time. And he put a scope into my knee and had a good look, and that was operation number 8. And it was his opinion that it was the rebuild work was kind of above his skill level, and that's the first time I've ever had a surgeon say that to me. So he was going to send me to a surgeon at the Royal Derby Hospital, who's widely regarded as one of the best soft tissue knee experts in the country. So that's what happened. We went ahead. We had I had the first operation in 2018 with this new surgeon, and then had the second operation on my right knee in 2019 in August. And I'll do a separate video on what happened in that operation, but sort of cut a long story short, I woke up before the end. The anaesthetic was insufficient. I felt them cutting, and the anaesthetist kept me awake for far longer than he needed to, and that did cause diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder, quite understandably. Now, what really put me into the position I am today is an aggregation of all these things, but then what came next. So I recovered from my 10th operation, and my last operation to date, towards the end of 2019, and I was living with my then fiancée in the first house that I bought. I bought with her, and my father, who is still to this day my hero, and was the man that I was most open with, and the person I was most open with about how I was doing with the pain and the condition, because he himself suffered with multiple sclerosis, so he had a good insight as to how things were. He had a stroke in the beginning of December 2019. Now, that date's going to start ringing a bell for various people, or that period of time, because that was when the first words about coronavirus started coming out publicly. And he went into a hospital in Mansfield, and I was up every single weekend, going through redundancy myself at that point. I was up every single weekend seeing him, and then twice a week. And then into February, they finally realised he'd had a stroke and it wasn't just his MS worsening. However, because of the COVID situation, the NHS, as I was told by the staff there, were very much on the basis of we need to sort of clear the decks and get people out of hospital to prepare for the waves of people that are invariably going to come in with COVID. So they sent him home to his small council flat with a care package in place. However, as many people will recall, the first wave of COVID that hit the beginning of 2020, so into March 2020 now, there wasn't testing available, there was hardly any, and what there was reserved for hospitals. So many of the care people who'd been assigned to work with my father were having to isolate. So I made the decision with my then fiancée that although I was on crutches and I was having the occasional dislocation, I would go and stay with him and do everything I could to look after him, because he'd really only been left with the use of one arm at that point. And I worked 18 hours a day looking after him. There were hoists and various bits of equipment, but it still puts a huge amount of strain on you physically. I separated my left elbow, dislocated knees, shoulders, fingers, looking after him. I wouldn't change it for the world, but putting that kind of pressure on yourself for weeks at a time, it's a bad way to go. Anyway, my father eventually contracted pneumonia as a result of having further strokes and having to go into hospital, and I was informed mid-April that he was going to pass away, so I went up to look after him along with my ex-fiancée. She volunteered, and we looked after him for the weekend while he passed away. Anyway, over the subsequent weeks after that, while I'm sorting his bits and pieces out and sort of dealing with my own grief that not only is in my father, but my hero has passed away, and my kind of guide as to how to manage the pain, and I am struggling with managing it at that point. I'm having more dislocations because of what I've put my body through. My ex-fiancée and I separate. She remains in the house. I go and stay with various family members, and it's while I'm staying with a beloved aunt of mine that I start having more and more dislocations. I move back from my aunt's up to my mum's place, my mum and her partner, very lovely gentleman, and from there I went from a dislocation every couple of days to a dislocation a day, more than one dislocation a day, until where I sit right now with 100 dislocations a day. I sit very still in these videos for a reason. It's because I don't want to have dislocations on camera unless I can possibly avoid it, because I don't think you good people really want to see a grown man kind of writhing and screaming and things like that. It's not a very fun experience. And that brings us up to the kind of present time, which will be the subject of our next video. There are several incidents that I've kind of gone through very quickly today that I will talk about in greater detail in future videos, sort of post-op issues and issues with identifying my EDS and things, and obviously, as I've mentioned before, that happened back in 2021, August 2021, so that's a long time to go from basically the tail end of 2004 to 2021. It's almost 17 years exactly, and that's a very long time to wait for a diagnosis. And as we'll discuss in future videos, had they realised a lot earlier, it would have undoubtedly been a case that I wouldn't have had any of the surgeries that I then went on to have, which have undoubtedly, and this is the words of surgeons I've met with and things like this, have made my situation worse than it kind of needed to be. So that covers in very broad strokes, so to speak, and relatively quickly. I appreciate we're moving up on 29 minutes and almost half an hour, but that broadly covers how I've ended up where I am in the last 18 and a bit years. So that should explain to people how they can kind of also see the warning signs, not only for chronic pain, but also for people around them that may have EDS and it's not being identified. So in the next video, we'll talk about sort of where I am at the present day, what that looks like, and how that affects me on a day-to-day basis. Anyway, thanks very much for your time, and also look out for upcoming article in the Herald paper in Scotland, where my situation will be discussed in detail. Thanks very much for your time, and I hope you've enjoyed the video. Bye.